Yeah. Thank you. Is it okay? It's okay. And then I think the power strip. I think it's broadcasting.
Sure, I'm gonna say ritual.
Maybe.
Try from your computer so you can see on your computer.
Can I even start? Yeah. I was just gonna say. Thanks so much, Matt. I totally agree. Hi. How are you feeling, Noah? I'm feeling like a little weighty today, like with responsibilities.
It's a big day.
Yeah.
I don't think that power is working.
Oh, because it's not plugged in.
I think I remember saw that.
I just want to make one.
What?
Okay, I'll change 1 second.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Right, Noah here. All right, there he is. Hi, Noah.
Yeah. So where should we place the computer?
Well, does he have your slides?
Yeah, he does have. You have the slides, right?
But it would be good to have him seeing, basically seeing you while you're
Yeah,
talking,
okay.
and then we'll adjust it when we're having the committee Q&A. Your friend is going to need to put her computer in here so that we can have Noah present, and then we'll want to move on that. But for now, it should just be facing you in the screen. Okay. So are you? Why don't you project your first slide, and we'll get ready. Because I'm gonna start things off as soon as you're ready.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, you're up now.
Oh, that was today. Okay. Cool.
This is it. I guess no more edits to the presentation.
No more edits. All right. So you can project. All right, we're ready, and I think that's fine. I think Noah will be able to see when she's changing slides because he'll just see the color change, and then he can sort of track. All right, so I'm gonna call things to order now. All right, we're ready to get started. Welcome to the dissertation defense for Cheryl Chen. We're going to be following the standard format for defenses. There will be about a 45-minute, 50-minute presentation. That'll be followed by a short period of time for Q&A from the audience. We'll then ask everyone to leave the room except for the committee. And then the committee will sort of engage in about an hour-ish or so of Q&A and discussion with Cheryl. Then we'll ask Cheryl to leave the room, committee will discuss, and then we bring her back in. So the whole process typically taking 2.5 hours, say. So without further ado, please welcome Cheryl.
All right, so this is what I've been working on for the last few years. The title of my talk is going to be called Authorial Agency, Modeling and Managing Narrative Variations. So in case people didn't know, this is a PhD defense, and in my defense, I'm going to be answering these 3 research questions. First of all, we're going to be asking a question, why has it been as hard as it's been to move forward in the area of storytelling and using intelligent narrative technologies? And then how do we know even when we've accomplished something? And finally, we're going to talk about how we should understand and build stories through these new forms of technology. And so I guess a simpler way to explain it is here is a game that some of you may have heard of, Facade. Facade is a very highly interactive, very procedurally generated interactive drama. And it was a big deal. It was a pretty big deal. You could read kind of how Facade is one of the most important games ever created, said by Ernest Adams, The Future of Video Games by the New York Times, that it takes characters to a new depth, that pushing the boundaries of gaming and AI, and also that, you know, without the doubt, the best actual working interactive story world yet created, and, you know, genre-defining leap forward in artificial intelligence. And it's dated 2005, so it's been about 10 years. Now, I guess the question that I'm interested in, because I love this field, I love this area, I love this idea of being able to tell stories through technology, is why don't we see more of this? Like, what's stopping us? And that's the contribution I would like to make, is to be able to enable more facades. So we break down my work into 3 categories, and this is more or less the outline of my talk. We have authorial agency, authorial leverage, and role model. So authorial agency is kind of the theoretical background information, kind of a definition of the problem, but, you know, of course, throughout we'll be kind of deepening that. And then authorial leverage is the evaluation framework that I developed through my work. And finally, we have a research study to show kind of like empirically test it out and see kind of how it measures up. So who cares about this work, right? Like, what's the point of doing all this work if no one's going to care? So my 3 areas also correspond to 3 communities. Authorial agency is very theoretical, so it's geared towards kind of the game studies community, where it's like about critical theory and analysis of game and narrative. Authorial leverage is about metrics and evaluation, so this applies to artificial intelligence research. And role model is actually a prototype, like a proof of concept. So it's actually showing how we can tangibly make concrete steps forward. So we're going to start here. We're going to start with the first contribution, theory. And really, this is just the background and kind of a statement of the problem. So when we start out, we're talking about stories which have existed like for as long as we can remember. For as long as there have been humans communicating, there have been this idea of stories. And they come in different forms, in different formats. Now, I kind of need to make this distinction. This is kind of fundamental to my talk, as it emphasizes the author. We need to make a distinction for what is the author and what is not the author, right? So here we have the author, and here we have the audience. And the way I make the distinction is that the author has a bit of a variations focus on how it sees storytelling. The audience sees story as a sequence of events. And so more or less, we are talking about the differences between storytelling and story. So what do we mean when we say variations? Well, now, if you have let's make a metaphor, right? It's something that's not stories. You have a dress, and this dress has like different interpretations. When people see it, they feel something that may be contrary to what somebody else feels, right? And that creates a sense of variation. And yet this is still kind of an instance. It's a snapshot of a dress. It's a perspective with a given lighting, with a given angle on a dress. Now, from the author's perspective, the author is enabled to create kind of the material, take the materials and put together this overall experience. So the author is in a way managing the variations that are open for interpretation of the audience. So from creation to experience. Now, this is kind of a variation mindset, right? This is we're not saying that the author has variation thinking and the audience doesn't have variation thinking. We're just saying that because the author needs to think about creation and interpretation, and the audience is just concerned with the interpretation, that there's kind of more of a variation mindset on the side of the author. So then, there are all these decisions being made, right? So we're covering who's actually deciding what makes the story. And another good question to ask is what is deciding, right? Because what we're using also matters. And then we introduce this device, technology, something that is interactive, something that actually wants a response from the user. And then the variation mindset skews a little bit. You've given agency over to the user to create their own experience, to create their own world. You've given the ability for the game player to author part of the story, with the tools and the environment that the game developer or the creator or the author has created. So now the game developer creates, in addition to considering creation, interpretation, affordances, like creation and interpretation, affordances are the tools that they give the user, the game player, to give them the sense of agency in the world. And now the game player still can interpret, right, what's going on, but has some hand in the creation of how it happens. And then so with the introduction of computers, we're able to do all sorts of things. And with really smart computers, we could do even more sorts of things. This guy's gonna be my AI stand-in for the rest of the talk. So an example of agency. What do I mean by agency, or what do I mean by this like creation process? So, say we have like something happens, like an event, right? And there's a narrative. Now we're gonna apply, like, what does the author's agency look like? Well, the author could write something like, Perry was heartbroken because he loved her too. And so that the author has the freedom, the artistic freedom to say that, right? Now, if the AI system, if a technology, something, programmed were to create something, the program itself can make a decision on what is really being said. And I kind of represented that with like predicates and like, bound to certain constants, right? Perry is a constant, and he is heartbroken, and he loves Eliza. Now, the user or the audience can also have this kind of creative license by having the experience enable this choice, right? The dialogue trees are prevalent in the games that we play. And so here's yet another example of agency. So I'm showing that these three decision-making agents exist for intelligent narrative technology type story experiences. So now, like, as we're again going through the theory, we're going to kind of define it. So how has this been thought about in the past? So now we have this idea of like linear. Like, let's look at like linear stories. So how stories have traditionally been thought about, going all the way back to like Aristotle. Have we been trying to figure out what does it mean to tell a story? And so for linear stories, we have this idea that story. The way we tell these stories, right, is this concept of there is set of events, like the materials of the story, and the presentation of the story. So there's like a representation of how the story exists. Then we move to like kind of interactive spaces, right, and changes everything. The old model isn't enough anymore. We now need to introduce modes of play. So when we have this interactive space. What was created, this was defined by Marie-Laure Ryan, this idea of ontological and exploratory modes of play. And modes of play, whether or not you actually significantly impact the fate of the world, because before this, you didn't really have an impact on the fate of the world, right? Now it's interactive. And finally, this is the contribution of, this is like where I'm trying to push the direction of where this work heads towards, is this idea that now in addition to just being interactive, we're also introducing these ideas of intelligent environments, intelligent agents and characters. And for this, we're going to look at, again, taken from narratology. So I'm not like inventing this. This has been around, this concept, this paradigm of constituent and supplementary events. So there you go. With intelligence, we need more of that. And as we shift down, we kind of see that as it makes sense, as we create different types of technology, we need to shift the way we think about them. So how do these paradigms work with AI systems, and why there are problems? So going back to story and discourse, right? This linear description and this idea of story is that there are materials available in the world. There's a list of things that have happened, and the storyteller picks and chooses how to represent them. So in the metaphor with the dress, right? There is a dressmaker who makes a dress, and then someone took a picture of this dress and posted it on the internet, right? So the discourse is the photograph of the dress. But the problem with this way of understanding this paradigm, this dichotomy, is that it's still too focused on story. It's still focused on this end result, which is useful from the audience perspective, but maybe needs a little bit more from the authorial perspective, especially if the audience now gets to author the story as well. So now we need to think about storytelling, not just story. And so Marie Lauren's like, sure, now the audience gets to author things such as the fate of the world. And oh, is this okay? Am I like behind by one slide? Okay, sorry. Ontological. So she creates this idea of ontological exploratory modes of play. So here are some examples. Like ontological means that you have had significant impact on the fate of the world. And a very like typical example she uses is choose your own adventure stories, where you have these decision points and eventually you arrive at an ending that could be very different from someone else's ending. So the example for exploratory interactions or exploratory modes of play are games like Myst and Riven, which she describes as that like there's already something pre-written there, and that there will be and that there is this narrative layer. So there's like this second narrative layer, which is the narrative layer of the player who has decisions and can make choices and impact their narrative layer, but not impact the underneath narrative layer, which as a game developer, I find a little bit confusing. So this question of narrative layer, let's look at Facade, right? Facade is this highly highly immersive, procedurally generated, high agency type game. And there is this idea of two narrative layers. If you think about the history of what is going on in the story world. So you visit the story world, right? And you're here, and then you have all these possibilities of things that can happen. And that is like 15 minutes of drama, depending on how you play the game, but varying degrees of drama. But actually before here, there's like actually a history between this couple, Trip and Grace, and you kind of see that unfold, bits of that story come out at the end. So the question is like how do we, like this pinpointing of narrative layers is not quite so clear. And then, like you see dialogue trees all over games, right? Which layer am I in? Or when I'm designing the story, when I'm designing the game, like which layer do I design for? And then the second question I have, right, as a game developer would be, what does it actually mean to significantly alter the fate of the world? Is it enough to like change the gender of my character, or to make my me look like Michael Jackson, or to choose colors and these kind of differences? Do they matter? Is this exploratory? Is this ontological? Does it even make sense to ask that question here? Right? And then finally, this idea of episodic. There are games, there are stories, there are things that come back to the beginning again, because they just want, the idea is that like in the short amount of time, the actions that happen almost undo themselves and then arrive back at the beginning. Like in the Simpsons world, they always end up back on that couch. There's not a lot that's altering the fate of the world, but then within the episode, there's a lot that's going on. So how do we know whether one thing is significant or not? And Chris Crawford talks about this in terms of fold back in games. Okay, so yeah, when you introduce interactivity, it gets a little confusing. Because like when we're authoring games, right, we think of we're trying to create like all these different story bits, and what happens is you create exponentially growing authorial burden by having to create alternative realities, right? Basically, each decision point creates like a new reality, and so what we wanted to do is shift. Right, enable these stories to not just to have this space of exploration. So then we had things like drama management, right? This is how we introduce something intelligent, or having like some sort of probability of what's going to happen next. We see it in Left 4 Dead, we see it in Facade, we see it in games simply in games like Final Fantasy, where there's like something that probably will happen. We're not going quite, like there's some number crunching going on in the background. And this is because, once you introduce user agency, you introduce this need for choice. But then it becomes even more confusing when the system itself is intelligent, because it's making decisions. So yeah, agency all around. Okay. So again, like this work is about the agency of the author, and the reason why I think that we need to move in the constituent supplementary direction is because this is something that I'll explain later how it enables, and I'll explain it later with the metric, and I'll also show it with the system, how this actually helps to move a step in the right direction. But then again, you know, like if we have this thing, constituent supplementary events, where whether an event drives the story forward or not, like to me, this is the better definition. But you can still ask, you know, how do we determine if an event drives the story forward or not? And so what I say is, again, like focusing on the author, you know, the author decides. It's the author's choice what happens. So the takeaway from this section is seeing storytelling as constituent and supplementary variations enables this greater sense, will enable this greater sense of authorial agency. This is especially the case when we have more deciding agents, the player or an AI in the storytelling exchange. So now we'll move on to the framework. And hopefully this framework gives us insight onto how we can have more of this. This is what we're going for. We want more of this. And the framework is called authorial leverage. So this is work that I published a few years ago, and it was kind of like things had kind of been done this one certain way, and we wanted to go deeper. We wanted to kind of look at new ways of evaluating these storytelling systems. So authorial leverage, in its like published technical definition, is the power a tool gives an author to define a quality interactive experience in line with their goals relative to the tool's authorial complexity, which is expressivity. And that makes sense because we are part of this is part of the Expressive Intelligence Studio. And so authority leverage is actually, we're trying to ask the question of expressivity. Like, what does it mean to have more expressivity? What does it mean to define and evaluate expressivity? So authorial leverage is a combination between, is kind of a relationship between the user and the author. And this is kind of the high level theoretical representation of this. There's interpretive gains, which is like what the user experiences, and then the authorial cost, which is from the author's perspective. And we want to make this shifting from story to storytelling, shifting from the audience to the author. Again, not discounting the audience, but just considering the author as well. So the only point is, right, we aren't just going for better stories. We're aiming for better storytelling, if that makes sense. And so like in the past, right? This is basically saying like in the past, we focus on the effect that a game or a story has on the player, but actually, new kind of evaluation would be looking at a sort of approach to drama management, which we'll talk about in a bit. How it supports the author in kind of managing variations. So, quantitatively speaking, how do we break it down? It breaks down like this. So we have authorial leverage, and we have these 4 measures: quality, variations, flexibility, and authorial effort. These are defined, so it's better, I think it's easier to define things as with examples, right? So kind of how, like by defining them, I'll kind of just show how this has been done, how we've like quantitatively looked at these measures. So quality is a given. It's like kind of a typical one that we see a lot. This is the way it's been done. We determine by how the user feels and reacts and responds to the game or story. Variations is the space of possibilities, right? Like how different, how much agency, how replayable is this game? And we can look at that through play traces. Flexibility then is now focusing more on the author. So these 2 bottom measures are kind of like the ones that are newer to kind of compared to the ones that I just talked about. So these are the ones that authorial leverage introduced into the framework of all different types of the space of evaluation metrics. So flexibility, the idea behind flexibility is how much control does the creator have using the system? If the author wants to make a change, does it break everything? If the author wants to make the game bigger, make the game smaller. If the author wants to use the system and make an entirely different game, does the system effectively support the author in those endeavors? And then finally, effort, which we look greatly into. So effort is looking at how much is this system saving the author in how much is the system saving the author in being integrated into the story world? And I'm going to show you with an example. So here it is. So when we boil it all down, what we really are looking for with this contribution is like, how do we define a better, right? If we don't know what better is, then what are we really working for? And here I kind of represent this by showing, if there's these different kinds of stories, if there's linear stories, branching stories, current AI approaches, ideal AI system, right? Down around here, this is my better. This is like something more concrete to aim for. And we have these evaluation measures that are kind of fleshed out for us to help guide the process, right? So here you want an ideal system that requires low effort and optimizes everything else. In the linear story, you have almost everything of that, except you don't really have a lot of variations because it's linear. And you go through, I won't go through every single description, but this is kind of the framework is giving a theoretical trajectory for how we should be thinking about the problem. And so in summary, it's like a cost-benefit analysis of AI in regards to story. And moving forward, we're gonna look at drama management. So drama manager is an AI system that works with a game. So here we have a game world, and here we have a drama manager, which is like the artificially intelligent technology in the background, and it's making decisions too. The author made decisions in creating the game. The player is making decisions within the game, and then the drama manager is responding to the player's decisions. So here's the game world. There's a player. There are events, and what happens is the player triggers events that get communicated to the drama manager as plot points. So the player does things, and the game is like, "Hey, drama manager, this just happened," and the drama manager now has a list of possible responses to have. Like it has these tools. Now the drama manager also has affordances in a sense to interact or interfere or engage with the user. And it's given these DM actions, so plot point DM actions. So let's go, it's a little bit like diagrammy. So we'll go into like an example, right? So here we have a quest, a dungeon-like Zelda game where you're a character trying to escape the dungeon. And so you may be a little lost, like you're going in circles. The intelligent system in the game is like, wow, this player like probably isn't having the best time right now because they're just going in circles. So I'm going to interfere, I being the AI system, and I'm going to send in a pink monkey NPC to help, give the player a nudge. So the monkey says, all the other monkeys make fun of my fur, so screw them. This candle will totally help you get the heck out of here. And so now you have a new item. And now maybe this was what was stopping you. You weren't able to find it. And now the drama manager kind of nudged you and pushed you in that direction. And so how do we know this is better? I'll kind of give you an overview of this architecture really quickly. So we have plot points, which is just a partial ordered graph, right? So there's all these different preconditions that enable these different plot points to happen. We also have drama manager actions represented by purple squares. And then we have a player model. So what the player model does is it mathematically computes what the state of the player. Is the player lost? Is the player confused? It's like there are ways that we've like set up, like we've put like we've like labeled these different outcomes so that we could numerically compute the values for evaluating overall experience. And then what happens is there's a search, and in drama management we call it, we're using expected max search, which goes through and exhaustively evaluates all the total orders and then probabilistically pushes you in that direction that will benefit you most. So what that looks like is, say you've been playing a game and it alternates. So every time you make a motion, the drama manager will then respond with a reaction. And so you may be doing this, and you're kind of in a game state world. And now you must pick. You got to pick you're picking a new action. That action gets sent to the drama manager. And what the drama manager does is it now exhaustively looks at all the possibilities that are left to experience in this world, and looks at all the total orders of the whatever remaining partial orders there are. So as you play this game, that space gets smaller, right? Because you're like constraining it to the very end. In the beginning, you'll have the largest space. And then once it has all these, it scores them based off of your evaluation metric, right? And the evaluation metric is based off of what it determined the player or the author, what the author desired for the player to, what they defined it as like a good experience. And then based off of the highest evaluating branch of these choices, the drama manager will pick. So then it picks. And that's an example of a intelligent agent playing a game with you, almost like chess, but you don't really know it's there. And it's like reasoning about who you are and what you're doing in the game. And so when we evaluated this, right, we evaluated this, the way most systems have been evaluated, we ran user studies, and a question comes up that it kind of revealed that there's something that we were kind of taking for granted, this idea of what we're managing, right? It's called drama management. Maybe we're managing drama. Maybe we're managing experiences or plot points, right? Because the plot points are actually tangibly something we have. And these plot points are rooted into a physical world. These plot points were placed into different interactions that the player could have in this dungeon. And then after the game, we would ask the users questions. There'd be a survey, rate from 1 to 5. Were you able to see a chain of game events where one event caused another to happen? And this we're like asking about whether or not the story flowed coherently or whether it was very jumpy and like all over the place. Now the results were a bit inconclusive because what we're managing as authors and what we're managing as an audience is not exactly the same thing. The audience is experiencing something very different from what the author is experiencing, right? And we can't take the author's experience for granted. So based off of that, we created a new study, the authorial leverage study, where we're kind of shifting emphasis, right? So we had one study based on user experience that had user evaluations, and then we did one based off of author experience, or we ran simulated evaluations, right? So again, the goal is that we don't want this, not intelligent. The reason why it's like, well, why don't we just do everything like this is because there's exponential effort growth. The bigger the space gets, it's going to grow exponentially. So we believe that if we use something like a story graph and something intelligent to manage the possibilities, that we can shrink this space and shrink the effort. Like that's why we're using it. That's why it's important. Now, to kind of evaluate this idea of effort and how whether or not this is more effort than this, because this is the old way. This is the way people have done things, and this is the way people want to do things, right? Until something else comes along and convinces them otherwise. So what we did was we needed to take this and translate it into this. We needed to say, hey, here is the non-intelligent version of what the intelligent system is doing. So we did that. I did that using a Weka machine learning data analysis package. And I ran about 10,000. I had the simulation play the game 10,000 times. And then I took all these play traces and I fed it through a decision tree builder. And we built these trees, right, out of this game, going from this, right, to this. And this is kind of a zoomed in view of what this looks like, right? It's a bunch of if, then, else statements. It's essentially a table lookup. At this point in the story, this happens. If this is true, if this is not true, if this is true, if this is not true. And it goes down the tree until it gets to a leaf. And then these leaves of the tree return the appropriate response, the appropriate action. So it's taking search and translating into a table lookup. And so we would have these like big bushy trees representing the graphs, right there. And what we discovered is that there is like this was a way to quantify effort. This was a way that we could calculate like a value for how much work goes into creating an experience by taking the intelligence system and then translating it into like a table and generating these trees. So here we'll look at only the green line, the blue line, and the red line. Here are the results from that study. The green line is null. So in the green line, there's no intelligence. It's just a world that is static, and there's nothing paying attention to anything that you're doing. I mean, you're still able to do things to get out of the world, but there's nothing there to kind of nudge you along or to embellish the story for you. And so this is turned off. And through our evaluation metric, we saw how this was the lower bound for all the experiences. So here we have at the bottom, we have quality, right? So these are curves, and the quality is shifted all the way over, right? And then these are the number of stories that fell into the quality out of like 10,000. So it looks a bit like this. So then the red line is search. So the red line represents the AI. The AI system is running, and it appropriately sets the upper bound. So we show that with an AI system running in the background, the experience evaluates better without definitely evaluates better. And then in between, we basically took what the machine learning system did, broke it down to the tree representation, took out the search. Basically, we're basically replacing search with a decision tree. and we looked at how we could prune the tree to get something that most closely matches search. So we show that you can't quite get as good as search, and even then, these trees still have a significant branching factor. So the size of these trees, like these branching decision trees, determine, like we're showing, hey, if a person were to write this on their own, if they were to make this game without the AI system, this is how much more work they would have needed to do. So to summarize, there are two types of studies. There was kind of one based on user experience, one based on author experience. And the difference between these is the questions that's being asked. So the user evaluation asks, are these stories good? Do they make sense? Right? And then on the author experience side, it's authorial leverage asking, what are these stories good still? Asking, because it still matters. Variations, are there meaningful possibilities? Flexibility, can you make changes? And effort, how much work is required to create this? And so then we make this distinction, right? There's a complementary relationship going on, right? These first two measures match the audience, second two measures match the audience, and then and it kind of builds. This is like how I kind of break down these evaluation measures, right? Like authorial cost is effort over flexibility, interpretive gains is quality and variations put together. And this is what we got. So the three we kind of show you. So I just showed you how we looked at. We took like AI system, and we instead of evaluating from the point of view of the user's experience, like by asking the user what they thought overall, we kind of looked at it for the how much cost or how much effort did it take for the author to use this system and to produce end result. So the takeaway is that evaluation helps us think of the problem differently. Traditionally, stories could be seen as simply story and discourse, not taking into account the author's agency, creates significant overhead in the design and implementation. So then rather than focusing on the events or what the audience experiences, we focus on managing variations, which is what the author is doing. Right, and then here we talk about variations, right? The more we have, like the more sophisticated the world, the more types of variations we're invoking, right? Agency can also, not just the number of variations, could also be seen as how meaningful these variations are. And so in the next section, we're just gonna show. The next section is showing how we've like done this, how we can actually do this, and with the study. So kind of synthesizing contribution 1 and 2. So the theoretical contribution with the evaluation framework, right? We are throwing out there. I am throwing out there this idea that new paradigm, constituent and supplementary. Instead of looking at it as affecting the fate of the world, we're looking at what moves the story forward, and the author determines that. And from that comes this idea of constituent supplementary variations. So how would you what would be like a good metaphor for that? What would be like an apple? So how many people like to eat an apple like this versus like this? So how many people like to eat an apple like this? And how many people prefer to eat an apple like this? Right? These are, at least I've shown that these are different experiences, but the constitution of what it is still an apple. So when we combine this analysis with authorial leverage, we're seeing that that it's not focusing right on the story that's produced. It's not focusing on necessarily the outcome, but it's focusing on the process of how we get to the outcome. So then we can kind of grow that, right? We're talking variations. We have traditionally looked at story and discourse as one paradigm, ontological as an exploratory as another paradigm. And these are we can actually see these as variations. Like there are story level variations and discourse level variations, right? Here's an example of discourse level variations. Like variations in a language, Japanese, English. Variations in remakes, right? The story doesn't change, but you're not getting the same exact experience overall. And so this is but what I want to talk about is new types. Like why stay with just those kind of variations? Let's look at other types of variations. And I think having this vocabulary, defining this better, will arrive at a higher sense of authorial agency. And so when we talk about, here's kind of a quick example of what authoring, like what we mean by authoring as managing variations, right? Like you're a chef and you're handing someone an apple and you're like, here's the apple from the menu that you ordered. You could also make the decision that all apples will arrive like this, right? This is how the apples arrive in the restaurant. And another way, right? Like now we get more interactive. I suppose the restaurant could hand you an apple and a knife and say, here, you decide. You pick how you want to experience the story. And so what we mean by managing variations is how do we understand that space that we're creating? Like, what are the different outcomes that are possible? So I'm just going to introduce one type of one new type of variation, right? I'm going to call this ideological variations. Variations that kind of that take advantage of human bias, that take advantage of this idea of human interpretation. So here is a diagram from the early 60s. This is done by Abelson in like pre-Goldwater machine, which is a system that he built to represent how we rationalize facts that conflict with our belief systems, that are goals in how we understand the world, because everything we see has to translate into a story somehow. Everything that we see, we will rationalize for our belief system. And so some people will never change their belief system, right? So everything gets rationalized. Like, say, like, I believe in like faith healings or something, right? Like my naturalist friends would be like, you're crazy. There's got to be a more logical explanation than that. But to me, maybe that's the most logical explanation of them all, is that something happens and there's something magical going on that requires a new belief system to accept. So another one, kind of going deeper in the vein of ideological variation, is one called the Rashomon effect, based off of a very popular or famous movie called Rashomon. And this is a movie about a love triangle, very typical trope in movies and stories. And it's a murder mystery, which is very convenient for this sort of variation, because in a murder mystery, everyone is trying to prove their innocence. Everyone's the victim. And so the Rashomon effect is this idea that there are multiple accounts of a story, but none of them is really, like, none of them is actually wrong. They're actually all equally plausible. Like, multiple accounts, all equally plausible, but yet no story can coexist with another story. Like, the stories are so different, and yet they are equally plausible. And so these stories cannot coexist, which to me indicates that there is something meaningful going on that is not just story and discourse. There's, like, again, this other layer of variation that we need to look into. So we're closing in. We're going into the third contribution. And so in this third contribution, I kind of imagine a system that more or less looks a little bit like this. We have this idea of author, which sees the world as constituent supplementary. We have a system, an interactive system that works in these exploratory ontological modes. And then finally, we have a user that, like, ultimately sees the world as, like, plot and discourse, right? This is kind of how I see, like, the overall abstraction of this. So the final contribution I have, role model. Role model is a system we designed for the purpose of showing how we can move forward with in light of what, you know, the first two contributions have indicated. So by using low-cost variations, can we recreate meaningful outcomes? Can we create different variations that are meaningfully different? So low-cost variations, what I mean is supplementary variations. So variations that may not be critical to the constitution of the story itself. The claim is this is a bite-sized step, right? This is a way to move in the right direction. This is how we can see more facades in the world. This is a way to, like, kind of take another bite out of the problem, like a bite-sized piece out of the problem. And from a game design perspective, it makes a lot of sense, because, you know, assets are expensive, and that's why in Final Fantasy 13, where they're trying to give you this very, you know, beautiful, explorable world, everything kind of ends up looking very tube-like. Ends up being, like, very tube-like, because these, like if you create all this art and all these animations that are taking, like, lots and lots of resources, and you only see, like, a fraction of them, then are you really getting your money's worth, right? So if you have, like, it would be interesting to be able to imagine a system where you have these fixed assets, but you can actually create a higher sense of agency, because we're looking at supplementary variations, low-cost variations, and still giving the user a sense that they matter, that they're creating something very different than they would have if they had done something else. So again, we go into murder mystery. And so the idea, the art assets here are drawn by a comic artist, right? And she draws these images. These images have associated meanings to them. So these art assets are what we will deem as expensive. They get passed into they're put into the role model system, and they're bound. The system is bound. Binds meaning to these, right? So not only do you pass over these images, but you also say, you know, what these images must represent. So that is what the author is determining as constituent. So here we have an image, and it indicates two characters are brothers. If the system does not try to change that, because then you lose the meaning from the art asset, right? The second image will then say introduce the third character, like there's a girl in the character in the story. The next one is one brother is gets romantically involved with the third character, and the other brother is sad. And then, of course, as murder mysteries go, the murder happens, or at least somebody dies, right? So the system, what it's doing is it's taking in input, and the input, it's taking in these images, but because it's taking in these images, it needs to take these authorial specifications, these constraints that say the story must flow like this. And it's given a time span, and it's given properties that the author deems constituent. Like this is, the author is determining what is constituent. Now everything else then becomes supplementary. So a role model is written in a logical programming language called ASP, answer set programming. It's just satisfiability solving. We're model finding. We're looking at, given these constraints, produce me a model that is satisfiable. Like given this input, given these assignments, can we arrive at a story, like a full story? And these are modeled in like logical statements. Here's kind of the architectural representation of that. You'll have you'll have rhetorical parameters, which are kind of defining this world. So in part for role model, it's called role model because we're using role assignments. In a murder mystery, we have victims, we have aggressors, and so in the role model story, which is based off of Rashomon, right? The story that we use for role model, each character, there's 3 characters. Each character could either be a victim, an aggressor, or a bystander. A bystander doesn't really do very much, right? You can have a character that doesn't really have much of an impact. And then a victim is somebody who is harmed, and we model actions. We associate certain actions with causing harm. So if a character is harmed, then they are a victim. And then we have characters that are aggressors. So any character that causes harm is an aggressor. So it's what end of the harm are you on? And then after that, those rhetorical parameters are set. We also give it rationalization mechanisms that we talked about earlier. So in the rationalization mechanisms, what happens is if, say, somebody does something bad and they're constrained to not be a victim, then we come up with ways that we can logically explain away victimhood. Or we can logically explain away somebody doing something bad and how they're not to blame for it. And so this is all represented in rhetorical parameters. And then we have author specifications where we talk about characters and what they're doing and what happens. So this is like author specifications are what the images that the artist created, the expensive assets that are there need to have a coherent story. And then we have like objects and verbs and fluents, which are states of the world. Pass through an event calculus and then present it out to the audience. And we evaluate this. I'll show this in a little bit. Just to kind of show the code, here's like an example. This is not the love triangle story. This is just some story where there's a lot of violence. So you have an input. This top part is the input. This is just what the code looks like. Bottom part is the output. This is how the computer understands the story. And then this is actually this is an example of what the love triangle story looks like. And I won't go through all of it. This is what the love triangle story will look like. You can see time steps 0 to 6. So there's 6 time steps in this one. And these are the things that are happening. These are the properties of what's going on. And then this gets taken and passed into a JavaScript front end where I do some basic natural language generation to create like a somewhat, not too like cognitively dissonant experience. So, sorry. So somebody had said that I should show it instead of like, I had initially just kind of showing you the text, but I might as well just show you the study. And we can go through the images. So here's trial A, right? Like I prompt the user, the test subject as like, you're a robot, like that I'm a robot detective and I need to reason through this. And so help me out. Who's the victim? And here it is, right? Once upon a time, Al picked a fight with Perry. It was the case that Al and Perry are brothers. One day, Eliza and Al became acquaintances. She and Perry became acquaintances. Al gave apples to Eliza. Eliza gave flowers to Al. Then Eliza and Al fell in love and became a couple. Al had won the affections of Eliza. Eliza had won the affections of Al. She convinced Al to pick a fight with Perry. For whatever reason, Perry was unhappy. He picked a fight with Al. It seemed that Al picked a fight with Perry. Eliza had manipulated Al. Perry killed Al. He killed in self-defense against Al. As a result, Eliza was glad about what happened to Al. So it's a bit of a dark ending, as murder mysteries go. The second one, so trial B, then reads like this. So some of the users or the readers experienced this. It was the case that Al and Perry are brothers. One day, Eliza and Al became acquaintances. She and Perry became acquaintances. She gave apples to Al. Then Eliza and Al fell in love and became a couple. Perry picked a fight with Eliza. Eliza had won the affections of Al. For whatever reason, Perry was unhappy. He picked a fight with Al. It seemed that Perry killed Al. He didn't intend to harm Al. As a result, Eliza grieved the loss of Al. Perry grieved the loss of Al. In the end, Perry gave flowers to Eliza. Perry had won the affections of Eliza. So these are two different stories, and I wanted to see, given more or less the same art assets. Now you see that there are some extra ones thrown in there, and those are just kind of those are what I consider low cost. Like they could or could not be used. I just needed something there so that it wouldn't be totally blank. So going back to my presentation, right, here's trial A and trial B. Let's start it over. Okay, whatever. And then this was the story. This is what the users, they did a survey much like this. Like this is just kind of a snapshot of the story. Was Perry an aggressor? Was Perry a victim? Was Eliza aggressor? Was Eliza a victim? And here's the results. I had a statistician take a look at the data that we collected, and the conclusion was that Eliza, being a character that doesn't do very much in the story, Eliza is kind of a bystander by default. But because there are parameters set that forced in trial A, Eliza to be an aggressor, and forced in trial B, Eliza to be a victim. So Eliza was the one that we wanted to show would yield the biggest impact in the overall story, to kind of show that this method will work. And it indeed did show that, you know, the people who read story A believed that Eliza was an aggressor. The people who read story B believed that Eliza more or less was a victim. And we ran this to two-sample binomial testing, which I will not explain in detail. And so we looked at these different trials, and we wanted to show that make such a big jump with such little variation. This is something that the computer could manage with not a lot of work, with not a lot of overhead. And again, this is, as an example, as a proof of concept, as a prototype, this is just the beginning, right? There's so much we could do with Perry. There's so much we could do with Al. But for the purpose of just making this point, we looked at Eliza. So you know, the takeaway then from this study is that in our study, and I'm going to read it because this is like the punch, right? This is the punch for this is like, here it is, bam, the empirical evidence that we have. In our study, we found that while keeping the fixed art assets, users in the study identified different roles for the main character of the story, and as a result of changing the text. While other studies try to address the problem of having computers generate better stories, approaches often came at the cost of increasing authorial burden in other ways. In this approach with role model, we show an example of creating meaningful variations of story by leveraging human interpretation. This is an early example of what it means to have more author-centric design of AI storytelling systems that make use of constituent and supplementary paradigm, and how this grants us better authorial leverage. And so the conclusion, we're going to go back to the beginning, right? And I'm going to tell you how these questions, kind of just summarize how these questions have been addressed. So why has it been as hard as it's been to move forward? I believe, like, and what the study shows is that, in practice, as we're evaluating these AI systems, these more immersive, more procedurally generative stories, is that the emphasis of how we're getting there is kind of very focused on the user, and it's creating all this extra work for the author, and so it makes it difficult for the people to accept this approach, people to accept this technology. How do we know we've accomplished something? Well, authorial leverage answers that question, right? We created a framework with evaluative measures, and we showed how we could quantify these things and how, and the examples, right? This is just the beginning. This is like defining, shifting how, like, the trajectory of where we should be heading. And it also also has, like, with authorial leverage, we also show kind of the better, you know. It's also kind of giving a more fleshed out design of what better is. It's saying, here's an ideal AI system. Here are 4 evaluation measures. We can theoretically talk about them. We can quantify them, and we can always continue to quantify them better. So now we have something to aim for. And then the last thing is, how should we understand and build stories with intelligent technology? And it kind of brings back to this high level, imagine a system, right? The author cares about constituent supplementary, interactive world cares about exploratory ontological, the user, plot and discourse, because that's how they experience the world. And through that, then we can have our, our whole new area, a whole new type of storytelling made available. And that's the end of my PhD stuff. With more at the end if you wanted to know more, but we don't need to go there. Yeah, and I just wanted to thank my advisor and all the people who have been supporting me too.
So we have time for a few questions from the audience.
President Cheryl, great talk and great presentation, especially for someone who doesn't play a lot of video games or who reads, experience a lot of stories. I feel like I've learned a lot. And your example with parallelizing the characters that you gave is what I'm working with the most to imagine what all the role model could be used for. And so I want to ask what your vision was for seeing the most use out of this. What you're concluding that it's user interpretation, which is brilliant. It makes the cheapest variation.
Yeah.
So that's the cheap stuff, and it's super huge and powerful. So I'm imagining where this goes, and it seems like there's a huge realm of games and experience that people can have in different flavors of art. They could have this variation, the cheap stuff inexpensive art, I guess,
low cost,
low cost art, and then there's all the way up to Minecraft, and then really smooth 3D, where you could do a lot of variations. What do you see as ideal video game target for such an implementation?
Yeah, well, I've spent many years with my advisor, and he knows that I always think big. So I'm thinking world peace, right? Role model brings us closer to world peace. And this is how I think it does that. I think that we're in a world right now where things are still seen as black and white, and they're not so black and white. We have all these conflicts in the world, and I think telling better stories enables us to understand each other better. And seeing that there are multiple ways to interpret something, I think when we design a system, my advisor had actually designed a system, Terminal Time, that offended people because it was able to retell history from various perspectives. And when someone saw a perspective that they didn't agree with, there was an emotional reaction to that. They're like, how dare you exalt communism? Or how dare you, be religious or not religious, right? And what they didn't get was there's a system there. And the fear is that, oh my gosh, you're creating a propaganda generator, and what you're going to do is you're going to use this to manipulate the world. And what I believe is that as we release this information to the world, we're actually educating them, and we're showing them that these systems exist on this new way of connecting and understanding each other, breaking down the walls. And so these systems aren't used as a way to control people, but they're actually used to expose the ways that we have already been manipulating and controlling people.
Any others? Okay, well, thank you, Cheryl, again. I'd like to ask everyone to leave the committee.
And have some food, please.
Take some food on your way out.
Please.
I'll ask you more about world peace later.
And if you guys want to have dinner.
So the other thing is, Cheryl, if this creates an